In the east, on 27 November, the PVA Ninth Army Group initiated the Battle of Chosin Reservoir. Here, the UN forces fared better. Like the Eighth Army, the surprise attack forced X-Corps to retreat from northeast Korea, but they were able to break out from the attempted encirclement by the PVA and execute a successful tactical withdrawal. X-Corps established a defensive perimeter at the port city of Hungnam on 11 December and evacuated by 24 December to reinforce the depleted 8th Army to the south. 195-196, about 193 shiploads of UN forces and material, approximately 105,000 soldiers, 98,000 civilians, 17,500 vehicles, and 350,000 tons of supplies were evacuated to Pusan. 197, the SS Meredith Victory was noted for evacuating 14,000 refugees, the largest rescue operation by a single ship, even though it was designed to hold 12 passengers. Before escaping, the UN forces razed most of Hungnam, with particular attention to the port. 170-198. President Truman signing a proclamation declaring a national emergency and authorizing U.S. entry into the Korean War. In early December, UN forces, including the British Army's 29th Infantry Brigade, evacuated Pyongyang along with refugees. 199. Around 4.5 million North Koreans are estimated to have fled south or elsewhere abroad. 200. On 16 December, Truman declared a national state of emergency with Proclamation No. 2914. 3 CFR 99, 1953, 201, which remained in force until September 1978d. The next day, 17 December, Kim Il-sung was deprived of the right of command of KPA by China. 202. Fighting around the 38th parallel January, June 1951. B-26 invaders bomb logistics depots in Wonsan, North Korea. 1951. A ceasefire presented by the UN to the PRC after the Battle of the Chanchan River on 11 December was rejected by the PRC, which was convinced of the PVA's invincibility after its victory in that battle and the wider second phase offensive. 203-204, with Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway assuming command of the 8th Army on 26 December following the death of previous 8th Army Commander Walton Walker. The PVA and the KPA launched their third phase offensive on New Year's Eve, using night attacks in which UN fighting positions were encircled and assaulted by numerically superior troops, who had the element of surprise. The attacks were accompanied by loud trumpets and gongs, which facilitated tactical communication and disoriented the enemy. UN forces had no familiarity with this tactic, and some soldiers panicked, abandoning their weapons and retreating to the south. 205. The offensive overwhelmed UN forces, allowing the PVA and KPA to capture Seoul for the second time on 4 January 1951. These setbacks prompted MacArthur to consider using nuclear weapons against the Chinese or North Korean interiors, intending radioactive fallout zones to interrupt the Chinese supply chains. 206. However, upon the arrival of the charismatic General Ridgway, the esprit de corps of the bloodied 8th Army revived. 207. UN forces retreated to Suwon in the west, Wonju in the center, and the territory north of Samcheok in the east, where the battlefront stabilized. 205. The PVA had outrun its logistics capability and was unable to press on beyond Seoul as food, ammunition, and material were carried nightly, on foot and bicycle, from the border at the Yalu River to the battle lines. 208. On 25 January, upon finding that the PVA had abandoned their battle lines, Ridgway ordered a reconnaissance in force, which became Operation Thunderbolt. 209. A full-scale advance exploiting the UN's air superiority. 210. Concluding with the UN forces reaching the Han River and recapturing Wonju. 209. Following the failure of ceasefire negotiations in January, the United Nations General Assembly passed Resolution 498 on 1 February, condemning the PRC as an aggressor and calling upon its forces to withdraw from Korea. 211-212. In early February, the ROK 11th Division ran an operation to destroy guerrillas and pro-DPRK sympathizers in the South Gyeongsang Province. 213. The division and police committed the Gyeochang and Sancheong, Hamyang massacres. 213. In mid-February, the PVA counterattacked with the fourth phase offensive and achieved victory at Hongseong. However, the offensive was blunted by U.S. IX Corps at Chipyeongnai in the center. 209. The U.S. 23rd Regimental Combat Team and French Battalion fought a short but desperate battle that broke the attack's momentum. 209. The battle is sometimes known as the Gettysburg of the Korean War. 5,600 U.S. and French troops were surrounded by 25,000 PVA. UN forces had previously retreated in the face of large PVA-KPA forces instead of getting cut off, but here they stood and won. 214. U.S. Marines move out over rugged mountain terrain while closing with North Korean forces. In the last 2 weeks of February, Operation Thunderbolt was followed by Operation Killer, carried out by the revitalized 8th Army. It was a full-scale, battlefront-length attack staged for maximum exploitation of firepower to kill as many KPA and PVA troops as possible. 209. Operation Killer concluded with U.S. I Corps reoccupying the territory south of the Han River, and IX Corps capturing Hongseong. 215. On 7 March, the 8th Army attacked with Operation Ripper, expelling the PVA and the KPA from Seoul on 14 March. This was the fourth and final conquest of the city in a year, leaving it a ruin. The 1.5 million pre-war population was down to 200,000, and people suffered from food shortages. 215-171. On 6 March, MacArthur gave a press conference where he stated, assuming no diminution of the enemy's flow of ground forces and materiel to the Korean battle area, a continuation of the existing limitation upon our freedom of counteroffensive action, and no major additions to our organizational strength, the battle lines cannot fail in time to reach a point of theoretical stalemate. No one in Washington disputed MacArthur's prediction that a stalemate would develop. But a victory, because of the commitments and risks to achieve it would entail, was no longer considered practical. The preferred course, because it would be consistent with the greater strategy and preparations against the possibility of world war, was to seek a ceasefire and negotiated settlement of Korean issues. 216. On 12 March, Ridgway gave a press conference at his command post at Yeoju stating that regaining the 38th parallel would be a tremendous victory for the 8th Army. It would mean the encroachment of communism in Korea had been stopped, exactly what the UNC had set out to accomplish. Conversely, if the Chinese failed to drive the UNC out of Korea, they would have failed monumentally. In any case, he emphasized, we didn't set out to conquer China. 217. In late April, Peng sent his deputy, Hong Zhuzhai, to brief Zhou in Beijing. What Chinese soldiers feared, Hong said, was not the enemy, but having no food, bullets, or trucks to transport them to the rear when they were wounded. Zhou attempted to respond to the PVA's logistical concerns by increasing Chinese production and improving supply methods, but these were never sufficient. Large-scale air defense training programs were carried out, and the People's Liberation Army Air Force, PLAAF, began participating in the war from September. 218. The fourth phase offensive had not matched the achievements of the second phase or the limited gains of the third phase. The UN forces, after earlier defeats and retraining, proved much harder to infiltrate by Chinese light infantry than previously. From 31 January to 21 April, the Chinese suffered 53,000 casualties, 219. On 11 April, Truman relieved General MacArthur as Supreme Commander for several reasons. 220. MacArthur had crossed the 38th parallel in the mistaken belief China would not enter the war, leading to Allied losses. He believed use of nuclear weapons should be his decision, not the president's. 221. MacArthur threatened to destroy China unless it surrendered. While MacArthur felt total victory was the only honorable outcome, Truman was more pessimistic about his chances once involved in a larger war, feeling a truce and orderly withdrawal could be a valid solution. 222. MacArthur was the subject of congressional hearings in May and June 1951, which determined he had defied the president's orders and thus violated the U.S. Constitution. 223. A popular criticism of MacArthur was he never spent a night in Korea and directed the war from the safety of Tokyo. 224. British UN troops advance alongside a Centurion tank, March 1951. Ridgway was appointed Supreme Commander, and he regrouped the UN forces for successful counterattacks. 225, while General James Van Fleet assumed command of the 8th Army. 226. Further attacks depleted the PVA and KPA forces. Operations Courageous, 23-28 March, and Tomahawk, 23 March, were joint ground and airborne infiltrations meant to trap PVA forces between Kaesong and Seoul. UN forces advanced to the Kansas line, north of the 38th parallel. 227. The PVA counterattacked in April 1951 with the 5th Phase Offensive, with 3 field armies, 700,000 men. 228. The first thrust of the offensive fell upon I Corps, which fiercely resisted in the Battle of the Imjin River, 22-25 April, and Battle of Kapyong, 22-25 April, blunting the impetus of the offensive, which was halted at the no-name line north of Seoul. 229 casualty ratios were grievously disproportionate. Peng had expected a 2:1 ratio, but Chinese combat casualties from 22 to 29 April totaled between 40,000 and 60,000 compared to only 4,000 for the UN, a ratio between 10:1 and 15:1. 230. By the time Peng had called off the attack in the western sector on 29 April, the 3 participating armies had lost a third of their frontline combat strength within a week. 231. On 15 May, the PVA commenced the second impulse of the spring offensive and attacked the ROK and US-X Corps in the east at the Soyang River. Approximately 370,000 PVA and 114,000 KPA troops had been mobilized, with the bulk attacking in the eastern sector, with about a quarter attempting to pin the I Corps and IX Corps in the western sector. They were halted by 20 May and repulsed, with Western histories designating 22 May as the end of the offensive. 230-233. At month's end, the Chinese planned the third step of the 5th Phase Offensive, withdrawal, which they estimated would take 10-15 days for their 340,000 remaining men, and set the date for 23 May. They were caught off guard when the 8th Army counterattacked and regained the Kansas line on 12 May, 23 hours before the expected withdrawal. 230-235. The surprise attack turned the retreat into the most severe loss since our forces had entered Korea. Between 16 and 23 May, the PVA suffered another 45,000 to 60,000 casualties before their soldiers managed to evacuate. 235. The 5th Phase Offensive as a whole had cost the PVA 102,000 soldiers, 85,000 killed-wounded, 17,000 captured, with significant losses for the KPA. 236. The end of the 5th Phase Offensive preceded the UN May-June 1951 counteroffensive. During the counteroffensive, the U.S.-led coalition captured land up to about 10 km, 6 mi, north of the 38th parallel, with most forces stopping at the Kansas line and a minority going to the Wyoming line. PVA and KPA forces suffered greatly, especially in the Chuncheon sector and at Chiam-Nai and Hwashin. In the latter sector alone, the PVA-KPA suffered over 73,207 casualties, including 8,749 captured, compared to 2,647 total casualties of the IX Corps, 237. The halt at the Kansas line and offensive action stand-down began the stalemate that lasted until the armistice of 1953. The disastrous failure of the Fifth Phase offensive led Chinese leaders to change their goal from driving the UNF out of Korea to merely defending China's security and ending the war through negotiations. 238. Stalemate July 1951, July 1953. U.S. M-46 Patton tanks, painted with tiger heads thought to demoralize Chinese forces. For the rest of the war, the UN and the PVA-KPA fought but exchanged little territory. Large-scale bombing of North Korea continued, and protracted armistice negotiations began on 10 July 1951 at Kaesong in the north. 239 on the Chinese side. Zhou directed peace talks, and Li Kenong and Kaio Guanghua headed the negotiation team. 218. Combat continued. The goal of the UN forces was to recapture all of South Korea and avoid losing territory. 240. The PVA and the KPA attempted similar operations and later effected military and psychological operations to test the UN command's resolve to continue the war. The sides constantly traded artillery fire along the front, with American-led forces possessing a large firepower advantage over Chinese-led forces. In the last 3 months of 1952, the UN fired 3,553,518 field gun shells and 2,569,941 mortar shells, while the Communists fired 377,782 field gun shells and 672,194 mortar shells. A 5:8:1 ratio, 241. The Communist insurgency, reinvigorated by North Korean support and scattered bands of KPA stragglers, resurged in the South. In the autumn of 1951, Van Fleet ordered Major General Paik Sun-yup to break the back of guerrilla activity. The UN's limited offensive, 31 August, 12 November, to shorten and straighten sections of the lines, acquire better defensive terrain, and deny the enemy key vantage points, saw heavy fighting by UN forces, with I Corps and X Corps making limited tactical advances against PVA and KPA forces. The campaign resulted in approximately 60,000 casualties, including 22,000 Americans. The intense battles at Bloody Ridge, the Punchbowl and Heartbreak Ridge underscored the challenges of penetrating the Chinese active defense. Despite PVA-KPA losses of 100,000 troops, these were not crippling, and the PVA forces remained resolute. By November, the UNC abandoned major offensive operations, and the PVA launched counterattacks with some success. 242. From December 1951 to March 1952, ROK security forces claimed to have killed 11,090 partisans and sympathizers and captured 9,916 more. 67. PVA troops suffered from deficient military equipment, logistical problems, overextended communication and supply lines, and the constant threat of UN bombers. These factors led to a rate of Chinese casualties far greater than the casualties suffered by UN troops. The situation became so serious that in November 1951, Zhou called a conference in Shenyang to discuss the PVA's logistical problems. It was decided to accelerate the construction of railways and airfields, to increase the trucks available to the Army, and to improve air defense by any means possible. These commitments did little to address the problems. 243. New Zealand artillery crew in action, 1952. In the months after the Shenyang Conference, Peng went to Beijing several times to brief Mao and Zhou about the heavy casualties and the increasing difficulty of keeping front lines supplied with basic necessities. Peng was convinced the war would be protracted and that neither side would be able to achieve victory in the near future. On 24 February 1952, the Military Commission, presided over by Zhou, discussed the PVA's logistical problems with members of government agencies. After government representatives emphasized their inability to meet the war demands, Peng shouted, "You have this and that problem. You should go to the front and see with your own eyes what food and clothing the soldiers have, not to speak of the casualties. For what are they giving their lives? We have no aircraft. We have only a few guns. Transports are not protected. More and more soldiers are dying of starvation. Can't you overcome some of your difficulties?" The atmosphere became so tense Zhou was forced to adjourn the conference. Zhou called a series of meetings, where it was agreed the PVA would be divided into 3 groups, to be dispatched to Korea in shifts, to accelerate training of pilots, to provide more anti-aircraft guns to front lines, to purchase more military equipment and ammunition from the Soviet Union, to provide the army with more food and clothing, and to transfer the responsibility of logistics to the central government. 244. General Mark W. Clark replaced General Ridgway as commander of the United Nations Command on 12 May 1952. 245. With peace negotiations ongoing, the Chinese attempted a final offensive in the final weeks of the war to capture territory. On 10 June, 30,000 Chinese troops struck South Korean and U.S. divisions on a 13 km, 8 mi front, and on 13 July, 80,000 Chinese soldiers struck the east-central Kumsong sector, with the brunt of their attack falling on 4 South Korean divisions. The Chinese had success in penetrating South Korean lines but failed to capitalize, particularly when U.S. forces responded with overwhelming firepower. Chinese casualties in their final major offensive, above normal wastage for the front, were about 72,000, including 25,000 killed compared to 14,000 for the UN. Most were South Koreans. 1,611 were Americans. 246. While Chinese forces grappled with significant logistical and supply difficulties, the stalemate also stemmed from mounting frustrations within the UNC. Despite superior firepower, the war proved difficult to fight, and the U.S. public was becoming impatient of a war that was lacking a victory. By mid-1951, the stalemate had worn away Truman's public approval, and political pressures mounted on the Truman administration to seek an end to the fighting. On 29 November 1952, U.S. President-elect Dwight D. Eisenhower went to Korea to learn what might end the war. 247. Eisenhower took office on 20 January 1953, and his administration prioritized containment over rollback and sought to reduce American involvement in the conflict, contributing to the later armistice. 240. 8 240 9 250. Armistice, July 1953, November 1954. Main article, Korean Armistice Agreement. Men from the Royal Australian Regiment, June 1953. The on-again, off-again negotiations for the armistice spanned over 2 years, 1951–1953, 251. First at Kaesong, then Panmunjom, 252, and was the longest negotiated armistice in history, 253. A problematic point was prisoner of war repatriation, 254, the PVA. KPA and UN Command could not agree on a system of repatriation because many PVA and KPA soldiers refused to be repatriated back to the north, 255, which was unacceptable to the Chinese and North Koreans. 256. On 3 December 1952, the UNGA accepted India's proposed Korean War armistice. Voted as Resolution 610, Roman 7, 257-258, and thus was born the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission, 259. Stalin died on 5 March. The new Soviet leaders, engaged in their internal power struggle, had no desire to continue supporting China's efforts and called for an end to the hostilities. 260 China could not continue without Soviet aid, and North Korea was no longer a major player. Armistice talks entered a new phase, especially after the May 1953 test of the novel nuclear artillery shell by the Americans. The KPA, PVA, and UN Command signed the Armistice Agreement on 27 July 1953. 245 South Korean President Syngman Rhee refused to sign. The war ended at this point, even though there was no peace treaty. 261 North Korea nevertheless claims it won the war. 260-263. Under the agreement, the belligerents established the Korean Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, which mostly follows the 38th parallel. In the eastern part, the DMZ runs north of the 38th parallel. To the west, it travels south of it. Kaesong, site of the initial negotiations, was in pre-war South Korea, but is now part of North Korea. The DMZ has since been patrolled by the KPA and the ROKA, with the U.S. still operating as the UN Command. Operation Glory was conducted from July to November 1954 to allow combatants to exchange their dead. The remains of 4,167 U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps dead were exchanged for 13,528 KPA and PVA dead, and 546 civilians dead in UN POW camps were delivered to the South Korean government. 264. After Operation Glory, 416 Korean War unknown soldiers were buried in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, on Oahu, Hawaii. Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office, DPMO, records indicate the PRC and North Korea transmitted 1,394 names, of which 858 were correct. From 4,167 containers of returned remains, forensic examination identified 4,219 individuals. Of these, 2,944 were identified as from the U.S., and all but 416 were identified by name. 265. From 1996 to 2006, North Korea recovered 220 remains near the Sino-Korean border. 266. Continued division, 1954-present. Delegates signed the Korean Armistice Agreement in Panmunjom. The Armistice Agreement provided for monitoring by an international commission. Since 1953, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, composed of members from the Swiss 267 and Swedish 268 armed forces, has been stationed near the Korean Demilitarized Zone. In April 1975, South Vietnam's capital of Saigon was captured by the People's Army of Vietnam. Encouraged by that communist success, Kim Il-sung saw it as an opportunity to invade South Korea. Kim visited China in April 1975 and met with Mao and Zhou to ask for military aid. Despite Pyongyang's expectations, Beijing refused to help North Korea in another war. 269. U.S. Army officer confers with South Korean soldiers at observation post, OP, Aouilet, viewing northward in April 2008. Since the armistice, there have been incursions and acts of aggression by North Korea. From 1966 to 1969, many cross-border incursions took place in what has been referred to as the Korean DMZ conflict or Second Korean War. In 1968, a North Korean commando team unsuccessfully attempted to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee in the Blue House raid. In 1976, the Korean axe murder incident was widely publicized. Since 1974, 4 incursion tunnels leading to Seoul have been uncovered. In 2010, a North Korean submarine torpedoed and sank the South Korean corvette ROKS Cheonan, resulting in the deaths of 46 sailors. 270. Again in 2010, North Korea fired artillery shells on Yeonpyeong Island, killing 2 military personnel and 2 civilians. 271. After a new wave of UN sanctions, on 11 March 2013, North Korea claimed that the armistice had become invalid. 272. On 13 March, North Korea confirmed it ended the armistice and declared North Korea is not restrained by the North-South Declaration on Non-Aggression. 273. On 30 March, North Korea stated it entered a state of war, and the long-standing situation of the Korean peninsula being neither at peace nor at war is finally over. 274. Speaking on 4 April, U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel said that Pyongyang formally informed the Pentagon that it ratified the potential use of a nuclear weapon against South Korea, Japan, and the U.S., including Guam and Hawaii. 275. Hagel stated the U.S. would deploy the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Anti-Ballistic Missile System to Guam because of a credible and realistic nuclear threat. 276. In 2016, it was revealed North Korea approached the U.S. about conducting formal peace talks to end the war officially. While the White House agreed to secret peace talks, the plan was rejected because North Korea refused to discuss nuclear disarmament as part of the treaty. 277. In 2018, it was announced that North Korea and South Korea agreed to talk to end the conflict. They committed themselves to the complete denuclearization of the peninsula. 278. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and South Korean President Moon Jae-in signed the Panmunjom Declaration. 279. In September 2021, Moon reiterated his call to end the war formally in a speech at the UN. 280. Casualties. About 3 million people were killed in the war, mostly civilians, making it perhaps the deadliest conflict of the Cold War era. 1617 281 282 283. Samuel Kim lists the Korean War as the deadliest conflict in East Asia, and the region most affected by armed conflict related to the Cold War. 281. Civilian. Though only rough estimates of civilian fatalities are available, scholars have noted that the percentage of civilian casualties in Korea was higher than in World War II or the Vietnam War, with historian Bruce Cumings putting civilian casualties at 2 million and Genter Louis in the range of 2–3 million. 1617. According to one source, 1,658,436 civilians died, meaning a 74% civilian death rate. 15. Cuming states that civilians represent at least half the war's casualties, while Louis suggests it may have gone as high as 70%, compared to his estimates of 42% in World War II and 30–46% in Vietnam. 1617. Data compiled by the Peace Research Institute, Oslo, lists just under 1 million battle deaths over the war and a mid-estimate of 3 million total deaths, attributing the difference to excess mortality among civilians from one-sided massacres, starvation, and disease. 284. Compounding this devastation for civilians, virtually all major cities on the peninsula were destroyed. 17. In per capita and absolute terms, North Korea was the most devastated by the war. According to Charles K. Armstrong, the war resulted in the death of an estimated 12–15% of the North Korean population, c. 10 million, a figure close to or surpassing the proportion of Soviet citizens killed in World War II. 102. According to the South Korean Ministry of National Defense, there were over 750,000 confirmed violent civilian deaths during the war. Another million civilians were pronounced missing, and millions more ended up as refugees. Estimates of the number of civilians killed in the entire war range from 244,000 to 990,000 for South Korea. The North Korean government has never published estimates of civilian deaths in the war, but more than 1 million North Korean civilians and non-combatants killed has been an estimate common among historians who have studied the Korean War. 285. Over 1.5 million North Koreans fled to the south. 286. Military. Korean War memorials are found in every UN Command Korean War participant country. This one is in Pretoria, South Africa. See also Australia, Belgium, Canada, China, Colombia, Ethiopia, France, Greece, Luxembourg, Netherlands, New Zealand, North Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Turkey, South Africa, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, and United States. South Korea reported 137,899 military deaths and 24,495 missing, 450,742 wounded, and 8,343 prisoners. 18. The United States suffered 33,739 deaths in battle, including those missing and declared dead, and 2,835 non-battle deaths. 287. There were 17,730 other non-battle U.S. military deaths outside Korea during the same period, erroneously included as war deaths until 2000. 289. The U.S. suffered 103,284 wounded in action. 290. 290. American combat casualties were over 90% of non-Korean UN losses. U.S. battle deaths were 8,516 up to their first engagement with the Chinese on 1 November 1950. 291. The first 4 months prior to the Chinese intervention were by far the bloodiest per day for U.S. forces, as they engaged the well-equipped KPA in intense fighting. American medical records show that from July to October 1950, the Army sustained 31% of the combat deaths it ultimately incurred in the entire 37-month war. 292. 1,789,000 American soldiers served in the war, accounting for 31% of the 5,720,000 Americans who served on active duty worldwide from 1950 to 1953. 287. Deaths from non-American militaries for the United Nations Command totaled 3,730, with another 379 missing. 18. Breakdown of UN casualties. Chinese sources reported that the PVA suffered 114,000 battle deaths, 21,000 deaths from wounds, 13,000 deaths from illness, 340,000 wounded, and 7,600 missing. 7,110 Chinese POWs were repatriated to China. 13. In 2010, the Chinese government revised its official tally of war losses to 183,108 dead, 114,084 in combat, 70,000 deaths from wounds, illness and other causes, and 25,621 missing. A total of 208,729 dead or missing, 302. In 2020, Chinese state media outlet China Daily reported the number of Chinese soldiers killed in the war at 197, 653, 303. Overall, 73% of Chinese infantry troops served in Korea, 25 of 34 armies, or 79 of 109 infantry divisions, were rotated in. More than 52% of the Chinese Air Force, 55% of the tank units, 67% of the artillery divisions, and 100% of the railroad engineering divisions were sent to Korea as well. 304 Chinese soldiers who served in Korea faced a greater chance of being killed than those who served in World War II or the Chinese Civil War. 305. China spent over 10 billion yuan on the war, roughly US $3.3 billion. Not counting USSR aid. 306. This included US $1.3 billion in money owed to the Soviet Union by the end of it. This was a relatively large cost, as China had only 4% of the national income of the United States. 13. Spending on the war constituted 34–43% of China's annual government budget from 1950 to 1953, depending on the year. 306. Despite its underdeveloped economy, Chinese military spending was the world's fourth largest globally for most of the war after that of the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK. However, by 1953, with the winding down of the Korean War and the escalation of the First Indochina War, French spending also surpassed Chinese spending by about a third. 307. According to the South Korean Ministry of National Defense, North Korean military losses totaled 294,151 dead, 91,206 missing, and 229,849 wounded, giving North Korea the highest military deaths of any belligerent in absolute and relative terms. 286. The PRIO battle deaths dataset gave a similar figure for North Korean military deaths of 316, 579, 308. Chinese sources reported similar figures for the North Korean military of 290,000 casualties and 90,000 captured. 13. The financial cost for North Korea was massive indirect losses and lost economic activity. The country was devastated by the cost of the war and the American bombing campaign, which, among other things, destroyed 85% of North Korea's buildings and 95% of its power generation. 309. The Soviet Union suffered 299 dead, with 335 planes lost. 310. The Chinese and North Koreans estimated that about 390,000 soldiers from the U.S., 660,000 soldiers from South Korea, and 29,000 other UN soldiers were eliminated from the battlefield. 13. Western sources estimate the PVA suffered about 400,000 killed and 486,000 wounded, while the KPA suffered 215,000 killed, 303,000 wounded, and over 101,000 captured or missing. 311 Cummings cites a much higher figure of 900,000 fatalities among Chinese soldiers. 16. War crimes. Main article: War crimes in the Korean War. South Korean soldiers walk among the bodies of political prisoners executed near Daejeon, July 1950. Civilians killed during a night battle near Yongsan, August 1950. There were numerous atrocities and massacres of civilians throughout the Korean War committed by both sides, starting in the war's first days. In 2005–2010, a South Korean Truth and Reconciliation Commission investigated atrocities and other human rights violations through much of the 20th century, from the Japanese colonial period through the Korean War and beyond. It excavated some mass graves from the Bodo League massacres and confirmed the general outlines of those political executions. Of the Korean War-era massacres, the commission was petitioned to investigate. 82% were perpetrated by South Korean forces, with 18% perpetrated by North Korean forces. 312, 313, 314. The commission also received petitions alleging more than 200 large-scale killings of South Korean civilians by the U.S. military during the war, mostly air attacks. It confirmed several such cases, including refugees crowded into a cave attacked with napalm bombs, which survivors said killed 360 people, and an air attack that killed 197 refugees gathered in a field in the far south. It recommended South Korea seek reparations from the United States, but in 2010, a reorganized commission under a new, conservative government concluded that most U.S. mass killings resulted from military necessity, while in a small number of cases they concluded the U.S. military had acted with low levels of unlawfulness. But the commission recommended against seeking reparations. 314. Almost every substantial building in North Korea was destroyed during the war. 315–316. The war's highest-ranking U.S. POW, Major General William F. Dean, 317, reported that the majority of North Korean cities and villages he saw were either rubble or snow-covered wasteland. 319 North Korean factories, schools, hospitals, and government offices were forced to move underground, and air defenses were non-existent. 320. North Korea ranks as among the most heavily bombed countries in history. 321. And the U.S. dropped a total of 635,000 tons of bombs, including 32,557 tons of napalm, on Korea, more than during the entire Pacific War. 320 by the end of the war. 18 of the 22 major cities in North Korea had been at least half obliterated according to damage assessments by the U.S. Air Force. 323. During a Senate hearing in the spring of 1951, MacArthur expressed his horror at the devastation that the war was inflicting on the Koreans, describing it as the worst he had ever seen in his military career. As the most humane solution, MacArthur suggested that the war should be escalated in order to bring it to an end sooner. 324. Characteristics. U.S. unpreparedness. In post-war analysis of the unpreparedness of U.S. forces deployed during the summer and fall of 1950, Army Major General Floyd L. Parks stated, "Many who never lived to tell the tale had to fight the full range of ground warfare from offensive to delaying action, unit by unit, man by man. We were able to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. Does not relieve us from the blame of having placed our own flesh and blood in such a predicament." 325. A soldier of the Dutch detachment of the UN forces in North Korea prepares to return sniper fire. 1952. By 1950, U.S. Secretary of Defense Louis A. Johnson had established a policy of faithfully following Truman's defense economization plans and aggressively attempted to implement it, even in the face of steadily increasing external threats. He consequently received much of the blame for the initial setbacks and widespread reports of ill-equipped and inadequately trained military forces in the war's early stages. 326. As an initial response to the invasion, Truman called for a naval blockade of North Korea and was shocked to learn that such a blockade could be imposed only on paper, since the U.S. Navy no longer had the warships with which to carry out his request. 327. Army officials, desperate for weaponry, recovered Sherman tanks and other equipment from Pacific War battlefields and reconditioned them for shipment to Korea. 326. Army ordnance officials at Fort Knox pulled down M26 Pershing tanks from display pedestals around Fort Knox in order to equip the 3rd Company of the Army's hastily formed 70th Tank Battalion. 328. Without adequate numbers of tactical fighter bomber aircraft. The Air Force took F-51, P-51, propeller-driven aircraft out of storage or from existing Air National Guard squadrons and rushed them into frontline service. A shortage of spare parts and qualified maintenance personnel resulted in improvised repairs and overhauls. A Navy helicopter pilot aboard an active-duty warship recalled fixing damaged rotor blades with masking tape in the absence of spares. 329. U.S. Army Reserve and Army National Guard infantry soldiers and new inductees, called to duty to fill out understrength infantry divisions, found themselves short of nearly everything needed to repel the North Korean forces. Artillery, ammunition, heavy tanks, ground support aircraft, even effective anti-tank weapons such as the M23.5-inch 89mm Super Bazooka. 330. Some Army combat units sent to Korea were supplied with worn-out, red-lined M1 rifles or carbines in immediate need of ordnance depot overhaul or repair. 332. Only the Marine Corps, whose commanders had stored and maintained their World War II surplus inventories of equipment and weapons, proved ready for deployment, though they still were woefully under strength. 333, as well as in need of suitable landing craft to practice amphibious operations. Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson had transferred most of the remaining craft to the Navy and reserved them for use in training Army units. 334. Armored warfare. The initial assault by KPA forces was aided by the use of Soviet T-34-85 tanks. 335. A KPA tank corps equipped with about 120 T-34s spearheaded the invasion. These faced an ROK that had few anti-tank weapons adequate to deal with the T-34. 336. Additional Soviet armor was added as the offensive progressed. 337. The KPA tanks had a good deal of early successes against ROK infantry, Task Force Smith, and the US M24 Chaffee light tanks that they encountered. 338-339 interdiction by ground attack aircraft was the only means of slowing the advancing KPA armor. The tide turned in favor of the UN forces in August 1950, when the KPA suffered major tank losses during a series of battles in which the UN forces brought heavier equipment to bear, including American M4A3 Sherman and M26 medium tanks, alongside British Centurion, Churchill and Cromwell tanks. 340. The Incheon landings on 15 September cut off the KPA supply lines, causing their armored forces and infantry to run out of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies. As a result of this and the Pusan perimeter breakout, the KPA had to retreat, and many of the T-34s and heavy weapons had to be abandoned. By the time the KPA withdrew from the south, 239 T-34s and 74 Su-76 self-propelled guns were lost. 341. After November 1950, KPA armor was rarely encountered. 342. Following the initial assault by the North, the Korean War saw limited use of tanks and featured no large-scale tank battles. The mountainous, forested terrain, especially in the eastern central zone, was poor tank country, limiting their mobility. Through the last 2 years of the war in Korea, UN tanks served largely as infantry support and mobile artillery pieces. 343. Because neither Korea had a significant navy, the war featured few naval battles. A skirmish between North Korea and the UN command occurred on 2 July 1950. The U.S. Navy cruiser USS Juneau, the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Jamaica, and the Royal Navy frigate HMS Black Swan fought 4 North Korean torpedo boats and 2 mortar gunboats, and sank them. USS Juneau later sank several ammunition ships that had been present. The last sea battle of the Korean War occurred days before the Battle of Incheon. The ROK ship PC-703 sank a North Korean mine layer in the Battle of Haeju Island, near Incheon. 3 other supply ships were sunk by PC-703 2 days later in the Yellow Sea. 344. During most of the war, the UN navies patrolled the west and east coasts of North Korea, sinking supply and ammunition ships and denying the North Koreans the ability to resupply from the sea. Aside from very occasional gunfire from North Korean shore batteries, the main threat to UN Navy ships was from magnetic mines. During the war, 5 U.S. Navy ships were lost to mines, 2 minesweepers, 2 minesweeper escorts, and 1 ocean tug. Mines and coastal artillery damaged another 87 U.S. warships. 345. Aerial warfare. Further information: USAF units and aircraft of the Korean War and bombing of North Korea. The Korean War was the first in which jet aircraft played the central role in air combat. Once formidable fighters such as the P-51 Mustang, F-4U Corsair, and Hawker C Fury 346, all piston-engined, propeller-driven, and designed during World War II, relinquished their air superiority roles to a new generation of faster, jet-powered fighters arriving in the theater. For the initial months of the war, the P-80 Shooting Star, F-9F Panther, Gloucester Meteor, and other jets under the UN flag dominated the Korean People's Air Force, KPAF. Propeller-driven Soviet Yakovlev Yak-9 and Lavochkin La-9, 347-348. By early August 1950, the KPAF was reduced to only about 20 planes, 349. A USAF Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star dropping napalm in Korea, May 1952. The Chinese intervention in late October 1950 bolstered the KPAF with the MiG-15, one of the world's most advanced jet fighters, 347. The USAF countered the MiG-15 by sending over 3 squadrons of its most capable fighter, the F-86 Sabre. These arrived in December 1950, 350-351. The Soviet Union denied the involvement of their personnel in anything other than an advisory role, but air combat quickly resulted in Soviet pilots dropping their code signals and speaking over the radio in Russian. This known direct Soviet participation was a casus belli that the UN command deliberately overlooked, lest the war expand to include the Soviet Union and potentially escalate into atomic warfare. 347. After the war and to the present day, the USAF reported an inflated F-86 Sabre kill ratio in excess of 10:1, with 792 MiG-15s and 108 other aircraft shot down by Sabres, and 78 Sabres lost to enemy fire, 352-353. The Soviet Air Force reported some 1,100 air-to-air victories and 335 MiG combat losses, while China's PLAAF reported 231 combat losses, mostly MiG-15s, and 168 other aircraft lost. The KPAF reported no data, but the UN command estimates some 200 KPAF aircraft lost in the war's first stage, and 70 additional aircraft after the Chinese intervention. The USAF disputes Soviet and Chinese claims of 650 and 211 downed F-86s, respectively, 354-355. More modern American estimates place the overall USAF kill ratio at around 1:8, with the ratio dropping to 1:3, against MiG-15s with Soviet pilots but increasing to a dominant 12:1 against Chinese and North Korean adversaries, 357-358. Reports by Lieutenant General Sidor Slyusev, commander of Soviet air forces in Korea, are more favorable to the communist side. The 64th Corps claimed a total 1,097 enemy aircraft of all types during operations, for the loss of 335 aircraft, including loss to enemy ground fire, accidents, etc., and 110 pilots. Soviet reports put the overall kill ratio at 3:4 in favor of Soviet pilots, 359. As reported, effectiveness of the Soviet fighters declined as the war progressed, from an overall kill ratio of 7.91 from November 1950 through January 1952, declining to 2.21 in later 1952 and 1.91 in 1953. This was because more advanced jet fighters appeared on the UN side, as well as improved U.S. tactics. 359.